There is something so dangerous about what Jung discovered in the early hours of 1913, something so psychologically combustible, that his own colleagues refused to publish it for decades. His hands trembled as he wrote, not from fear of the unknown, from fear of what happens when the idea deeply known and finally demands to be spoken. What he uncovered that night would eventually rewrite everything we thought we understood about human consciousness, emotional depth, and the architecture of the sensitive soul. And here is the part that will either terrify you or set you free. If you have ever walked into a room and felt the emotional weather before anyone spoke a single word, if you have absorbed grief that wasn't yours and called it intuition, if you have been told your whole life that you feel too much in a world that feels too little much, in a world that feels too little, you are not disordered. You are not weak. You are carrying a nervous system that was built for a different kind of seeing. And Jung knew exactly what you are. He called you something the modern world has forgotten how to name. He called you the EA canary in the coal mine, the one who feels what others ignore, the one whose very existence is a warning system for a species asleep at the wheel. And what I am about to reveal will change how you understand your entire life. Jung spent 40 years mapping the human psyche with the precision of a cartographer charting unmapped continents. He descended into the underworld of the unconscious and returned with blueprints, shadow territories, archetypal geometries, persona structures and projection mechanisms. But there was one type of individual who fascinated him above all others, and troubled him in equal measure. These were the people whose psychic membranes were thinner than average, whose emotional receptors were calibrated to frequencies most humans simply cannot detect. In his clinical notes, he referred to this as innate sensitiveness, a constitutional predisposition that shapes how an individual perceives, processes, and is affected by both external stimulation and internal psychological material. This was not metaphor. This was not poetry. This was clinical observation, documented across decades of casework. And what Jung found shook the foundations of everything psychology believed about strength and weakness, pathology and potential. Let me tell you about a patient we will call Elizabeth. She arrived at Jung's practice in Zurich in the winter of 1921, referred by a physician who could find nothing wrong with her body, but could not explain why she seemed to be dying from the inside out. She was exhausted beyond reason, anxious in ways that had no traceable source. She described walking through crowds and feeling as though she was being torn apart by invisible hands. Not her own emotions, but the emotions of strangers seeping through her skin like water through cloth. Her family had spent years telling her she was dramatic. Her husband told her she needed to get to an APJ. Her doctor suggested hysteria. But Jung saw something else entirely. He saw a woman whose nervous system was not malfunctioning. It was functioning too well. She was receiving signals the world was transmitting: grief, tension, suppressed rage, unspoken despair. And because she had never been taught that these signals were external, she'd internalized them as her own. She was not sick. She was drowning in the emotional refuse of everyone around her. And no one had ever told her she was allowed to build a wall. This is the architecture of the highly sensitive person. Not fragility, permeability. The boundaries between self and other, between inner world and outer world, are not rigid in these individuals. They are porous, permeable, almost translucent. Jung believed this porousness connected the sensitive individual directly to the unconscious. Not just their personal unconscious, but the collective unconscious itself, that vast reservoir of archetypal symbols, inherited emotional patterns, and mythic structures that pulse beneath all human experience. For most people, this layer remains buried, accessed only in dreams or moments of crisis. But for the highly sensitive, it is always closing, always whispering, always demanding attention. This is why you feel drained by noise, crowds, and constant demands. This is why solitude is not a luxury for you, it is oxygen. Your nervous system is doing more work in 1 hour than most people do in a day. And no one taught you that this was not weakness. It was working. But here's where Jung's warning becomes urgent, and this is the part most people never hear. Sensitivity, unintegrated, becomes a prison. The same permeability that grants you access to depth, to empathy, to creative and spiritual realms most humans never touch. That same openness makes you vulnerable to psychic flooding, to emotional contamination, to what Jung called the absorption of the shadow material of others. You walk through a room and feel sadness so heavy it bends your spine. But the sadness is not yours. It belongs to the man in the corner who has been suppressing grief for 17 years. You feel it because you are open, and because you were never taught that openness without discernment is not compassion, it is consumption. Until you make the unconscious conscious, Jung wrote, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. For the highly sensitive person, this warning cuts deeper than for anyone else. Because you are not just contending with your own unconscious material, you are absorbing the unconscious material of everyone you encounter. You are carrying weight that was never meant for your shoulders. And if you do not learn to distinguish between what is yours and what is theirs, you will spend your entire life exhausted, anxious, and confused, not because you are broken, but because you never learned the most important skill a sensitive soul can possess. Here is what made Jung realize the true danger. It was not the absorption itself. It was what happens when a highly sensitive individual, overwhelmed, overburdened, and unable to differentiate their own emotions from the emotional chaos around them, begins to suppress the very sensitivity that defines them. When society tells you your depth is a disorder, when your parents dismiss your tears as too much a diach, when the world rewards noise, speed, and emotional numbness, what happens to the child who was born to feel everything? They learn to hide. They learn to mask. They learn to bury the very qualities that could one day become their greatest gifts. And in that burial, Jung saw something catastrophic forming. Not healing, not adaptation. Fragmentation. The psyche Jung taught is not a fixed entity. It is a dynamic system of opposing forces. Conscious and unconscious. Light and shadow. Persona and authentic self. In a healthy individual, these forces are in dialogue, in tension, in creative relationship. But when an essential part of the self is rejected, when sensitivity is shamed, suppressed, and driven underground, it does not disappear. It splits off out. It becomes shadow. And shadow, once separated from consciousness, does not sleep quietly. It waits. It gathers mass. And eventually, it returns, not as a gentle knock on the door, but as an explosion that terrifies the individual and everyone around them. This is why the highly sensitive person who has spent decades being nice, being accommodating, being the deep good one, this is why they sometimes erupt in rage that shocks even themselves. The suppressed parts do not vanish. They compound. And the longer they are denied, the more violent their eventual emergence. But the most disturbing part of Jung's research was not the shadow itself. It was who carries it. Highly sensitive individuals, because of their openness and their natural tendency toward empathy, often become what Jung called shadow containers for their families, their relationships, their entire communities. They unconsciously agree to hold the emotional pain, shame, and trauma that others refuse to confront. They become the designated feeler, the emotional scapegoat, the one who cries at dinner while everyone else pretends nothing is wrong. This is not weakness. This is the porousness exploiting. You were open, so others poured their darkness into you. You absorbed it because you did not know you had a choice. And over time, this dynamic manifested as anxiety, chronic illness, depression, or spiritual breakdown, not because something was wrong with you, because you were carrying cargo that was never yours to carry. Remember where we started. Jung's hands shaking in 1913. What he discovered that night, what kept him from sleeping for weeks, was not just the existence of the shadow. It was the realization that the people most likely to be destroyed by the shadow were not the callous, not the defended, not the emotionally armored. It was the sensitive, the opening, the ones whose very gift made them most susceptible to psychological colonization. And this is why he spent the rest of his life developing what he called individuation, the process of integrating the conscious and unconscious, of reclaiming split-off parts, of building a self that is whole rather than fragmented. For the highly sensitive person, individuation is not optional. It is survival daughter. It is the difference between a life of drowning in emotions that aren't yours and a life of sovereign depth. It is the difference between being a sponge and being a filter. Now let me tell you about the transformation moment, because this is where everything changes. There was a woman, we will call her Miriam, who came to analysis in her late 30s. She had spent her entire adult life in service, social work, non-profit leadership, the kind of work that allows you to pour yourself into others while conveniently avoiding the wreckage within. She was beloved, she was radiating, and she was falling apart. Not visibly, Miriam had perfected the art of the functional collapse, smiling through exhaustion, giving through depletion. She had built her entire identity around being the helper, the healer, the one who could hold space for anyone's pain. But she had never once held space for her own. Her shadow, by the time she arrived in that quiet room with its leather chair and its ticking clock, had grown enormous. Decades of suppressed anger, decades of unacknowledged grief, decades of saying yes when every cell in her body screamed a no. And her body had begun to speak what her words refused to name. Chronic fatigue, autoimmune flares, a nervous system that had been on high alert so long it no longer knew how to rest. The work began slowly. Dream analysis, active imagination, the painstaking excavation of everything she had buried to become the person the world needed her to be. And then, one evening, something shifted. She had been working with a dream image, a locked door in a basement, behind which she could hear something breathing. For weeks, she had refused to open it. For weeks, her analyst had waited. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday, she turned the handle. What she found was not a monster. It was a child. Herself, at 7 years old, crouched in the corner of that dream basement, furious and terrified and absolutely adoning, pretending to be okay. All the rage she had never been allowed to feel. All the grief she had swallowed so others could remain comfortable. All the annoy she had been forbidden to speak. It was there. It had always been there. Waiting. What happened next terrified everyone who knew her, not because she attacked, not because she collapsed, but because she simply began to speak. For the first time in her life, Miriam said things out loud that she had been carrying in silence for decades. She named the resentment she had felt toward her mother. She acknowledged the exhaustion that had been masquerading as dedication. She drew lines. She ended relationships that had been draining her since before she could name what draining meant. And here's the paradox that Jung understood better than anyone. She did not become was empathetic. She became precisely empathetic. She could finally feel what was hers and release what was not. She could hold space for others without losing herself inside their pain. She had integrated her shadow, not by destroying it, but by listening to it, by giving it a seat at the table of her psyche, by allowing the full spectrum of her humanity to exist within her, rather than outsourcing the dark parts to the basement where they festered and grew teeth. This is the integration threshold. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the self, not the small self of ego and social performance, but the larger self that encompasses all aspects of the psyche, light and dark, masculine and feminine, persona and shadow. The highly sensitive person who achieves this integration does not become sensitive. They become sovereignly sensitive. Their nervous system still perceives what others miss. Their psyche still walks closer to the unconscious than most humans will ever dare. But they are no longer at the mercy of that depth. They have become its stewardess. But here is the warning within the transformation, and this is the trap that catches more sensitive souls than almost any other. Jung observed that when people begin to access unconscious material through dreams, visions, meditation, or any form of deep inner work, they become vulnerable to what he called ego inflation. The ego begins to identify with the archetypes it encounters. It mistakes itself for the self, for the divine, for something chosen. And for the highly sensitive person, whose natural attunement to the intuitive and feeling functions already grants them access to realms others cannot perceive, this trap is devastatingly seductive. You begin to believe your dreams are prophetic. You interpret every synchronicity as evidence of cosmic selection. You start speaking with certainty about what is meant to be, offering spiritual guidance you have not earned the authority to give. This is not enlightenment. This is depossession, numinous possession by the archetype of the healer, the prophet, the divine messenger. And it is one of the most dangerous states a sensitive soul can inhabit. The brighter the persona, Jung warned, the darker the shadow. And there is no persona brighter than the one constructed from spiritual identity. The highly sensitive person who falls into this trap speaks of love and light while harboring deep resentment. They refuse to examine. They preach peace but explode in defensiveness when challenged. They use spiritual practice to bypass trauma rather than confront it, rebranding childhood neglect as karma, calling toxic relationships twin flame lessons, abandoning personal boundaries in the name of Joanness. This is not depth. This is the shadow wearing the costume of awakening. And Jung's solution was not to abandon spirituality, but to deepen it, to bring it down from the heavens and into the body, the emotions, the messy and sacred territory of everyday human life. So what does the integrated sensitive actually look like? They are not floating above their humanity. They are rooted in it. They have done the work of shadow integration, the painstaking, uncomfortable, often humiliating work of acknowledging their own capacity for darkness, their own anger, their own envy, their own desire for power, for recognition, for things the spiritual ego finds distasteful. They have stopped pretending to be only light, and in doing so, they have reclaimed the full voltage of their being. They can walk into a room and feel its emotional weather without becoming it. They can hold space for suffering without drowning. They can say no without guilt, yes without resentment, and don't know without shame. They have built what Jung called psychic boundaries, not walls that block connection, but membranes that discern. They know where their feelings end and someone else's begin. And this knowledge is not a limitation of their empathy. It is the completion of it. The change was not temporary. It was irreversible. Because once you have seen behind the veil, once you have met your shadow and invited it home, you cannot pretend it does not exist. You cannot go back to the fractured existence of performing wholeness while burying half of yourself in the basement. The integration rewrites you at the level of nervous system, at the level of soul architecture, at the level of how you move through every room and relationship for the rest of your life. And here is what no one tells you about the integrated sensitive. Their presence alone begins to change the people around them. Not through preaching, not through correction, but through the simple fact of their wholeness. When you stand in front of someone who has stopped hiding from themselves, you feel it. You feel the invitation to stop hiding too, or you feel exposed in a way that makes you want to run. The integrated sensitive becomes a revelation system. Their presence forces a choice: evolve or expose yourself by refusing to. But let me be very clear about what this power is and what it is not. The integrated sensitive does not become a weapon. They do not use their perception to dominate, manipulate, or punish. They could, and that is the terrifying part. When you can see what others hide, when you can feel the truth beneath the performance, when you understand the psychological architecture of every room you enter, you have access to power most humans cannot imagine. But the integration that brings this clarity also brings something else: irresponsibility. The integrated sensitive knows that destruction is easy. Anyone with their level of perception could dismantle relationships, expose weaknesses, pull threads that unravel entire lives. But that is not what wholeness produces. Wholeness produces discernment, the ability to see clearly and choose wisely. The integrated sensitive removes rather than destroys, rebuilds rather than punishes, serves rather than controls. Not because they are incapable of darkness, they have met their darkness intimately, but because they have chosen, consciously and repeatedly, to transmute rather than project. This is the new archetype. This is what Jung was pointing toward when he spoke of individuation not as a destination, but as a process, a lifelong journey of becoming more fully oneself by integrating all that one has rejected. The integrated sensitive is not someone who has transcended their humanity. They are someone who has acclaimed it, all of it. The light and the shadow, the gift and the wound, the enormous capacity for feeling and the ferocious necessity of boundary. They are the psychological architect, redesigning their inner world with intention rather than inheritance. They are the conscious outlier, walking through a society built for numbness while remaining exquisitely, sovereignly alive. They're the canary who has learned not just to warn the mine, but to clearly leave it, and to sing not from survival, but from freedom. If you have ever been told you are too sensitive, that was not a diagnosis. That was a dismissal from people who did not understand what they were looking at. If you have spent your life absorbing the emotions of everyone around you, drowning in feeling without knowing which feelings were yours, that was not weakness. That was a gift operating without instruction. You were handed a Ferrari nervous system with no manual, no map, no one to tell you that what you were experiencing was real, and that it required eye training, not medication. If you have ever felt like an alien in a world that rewards volume over depth, speed over meaning, performance over presence, you are not wrong. The world is built for a different kind of human. But here is what Jung knew that most people will never understand. The world needs exactly what you carry. The highly sensitive person is the advanced warning system for a species that has learned to ignore its own destruction. You feel what is coming before it arrives. You perceive the cracks in systems others call stable. You carry the emotional intelligence that could, if it were valued and integrated rather than pathologized and suppressed, guide humanity through the transitions it refuses to prepare for. This is not pathology. This is evolution wearing a human face. And here is the invitation that matters more than any knowledge I have shared. You must do the work. You must descend into your own basement and open the doors you have been avoiding. You must meet the child you buried to survive. You must give voice to the rage, the grief, the hunger, the that has been locked in your throat since before you learned to speak. Shadow work is not comfortable. It is not glamorous. It does not photograph well for social media. But it is the only path from fragmentation to wholeness, from drowning to sovereignty, from carrying weight that was never yours to walking through the world as someone who knows themselves, fully, unflinchingly, without apology. Jung spent his entire life teaching that the goal of human development is not happiness, not success, not even peace, it is wholeness. The integration of all that we are, the reclamation of all that we have rejected, the courage to become not who we were told to be, but who we actually are, including the parts that terrify us, the parts that others found unacceptable, the parts we have spent decades hiding even from ourselves. You are not too much. The world is too little. And the question is not whether you can handle your sensitivity. The question is whether you are ready to stop handling it and start wielding it. If this has stirred something inside you that you cannot name, if you have recognized yourself in these words and felt the strange vertigo of being seen, then you already know what comes next. The work is yours. No one can do it for you. But you are not alone, and you were never meant to carry this alone. Comment below I choose integration if you are ready to begin. Or simply, ain't she everything, if you have already started and recognize yourself in this transmission. The highly sensitive person who completes this journey does not become someone new. They become who they always were, before the world told them to be smaller, quieter, less. They return to the wholeness that was their birthright. And in that return, they become capable of something most humans never access, the ability to transform not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone they touch. Not through force, not through persuasion, through through the undeniable gravity of a human being who has stopped running from themselves. If this resonated, truly resonated, not just intellectually but somewhere deeper, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are people in your life right now who are drowning and do not know why. People who have been told their entire lives that their depth is a defect. People who are one conversation away from understanding that what they carry is not a curse. It is a calling. And if you want to go deeper, if you are ready to understand exactly how to begin the shadow work that transforms everything, watch my next video. What Jung never told you about the shadow's real purpose. In it, I reveal the single most dangerous mistake sensitive people make when they begin this work. And the one question that, if answered honestly, accelerates integration faster than years of therapy. You were built different. Not broken. Not disordered. Different in diet. And the world has never needed what you carry more than it needs it now. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.